Hello and welcome back to the podcast. In a week when the BBC is once more under attack about its coverage of the Middle East and Gaza in particular, not helpful when you are trying to win support for the renewal of your charter, your right to exist. The Royal Charter is the constitutional basis for the BBC. It sets out the corporation's object, mission and public purposes. It also outlines the corporation's governance and regulatory arrangements, including the role and composition of the BBC board. The current charter began on the 1st of January 2017 and ends on the 31st of December 2027. The clock is ticking. Who better to discuss the Royal Charter than with the Director General who was in charge the last time around? Tony Hall, Lord Hall of Birkenhead, was the DG from 2013 until 2020. He joined the corporation as a trainee in 1973, rising to be Director of BBC News and Current Affairs in 1990, and he continued to lead BBC News until 2001. During his tenure, he launched BBC Parliament, BBC 5 Live, BBC News 24 and BBC News Online, before taking some time off, about 12 years in fact, to run the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, with considerable success. Lord Hall, Tony Hall, welcome to the podcast. When you look what the BBC is now facing in terms of charter renewal and so on, do you think they've got a tougher job than when you had to do it 12 years ago?
I think they've got potentially even more important job than 11 years ago. I think they've got a chance to set the BBC on a future which is not just for 5 years or 11 years or whatever, but is for a generation, because you've got a government which actually will think more benignly, I think, about the BBC, will understand some of the arguments about the BBC being part of our social infrastructure, not just a business to be curtailed. And I think they have a great chance, therefore, to go beyond the normal charter length and do something quite big. That's why I think the debate, Roger, about which Samir Shah is engaged in, and I thoroughly agree with him, which is make this charter forever. So it's like the Bank of England or it's like the British Council. Stop using it as a way of keeping the political pressures always on the BBC, which is what the charter process does. I think that's really important and really key. And you can either establish it by saying it's a charter forever, which is what I would do, or you could say establish the BBC like Channel 4. That doesn't mean a loss of accountability. It doesn't mean any diminution in what the BBC is answerable for, but it would stop this constant process of using the charter without a proper public debate to beat up on the organisation, bluntly.
Well, there's something beating up going on at the moment. I mean, it's quite intense, isn't it? Obviously, the immediate cause at the moment is the coverage of Israel, or particularly Gaza, not held by one of your former colleagues, a guy who worked for you, Danny Cohen, who says BBC bias is not just inept, it's become sinister, sickening and shameful. He claims the BBC as an organisation is anti-Semitic. And I've but I've gone on organisations like GB News and so on, talk to try and defend the BBC. But what people don't seem to understand here is there's a propaganda war going on. And the BBC is caught in the middle of it and is in a virtually no-win situation, isn't it?
It's in a very difficult situation, and I think it's a very kind of polarising situation. But it's also, I remember during the Falklands War, during other conflicts, the BBC goes through these sort of difficult patches, and it's just got to hang on to it being what it is, which is the impartial voice that we all need to make sense of what is happening and what is flying at us from all sides. So I think the BBC's impartiality now is more important than ever. There's a particular issue with the programme which is under review at the moment, and about was a Hamas relative involved in that or not. I think the BBC are doing the right thing, which is it's a board-level investigation to look at what happened, and I think it seems to me the proper processes are being followed there.
But when I've tried to introduce issues such as the fact that Israel won't allow independent foreign journalists into Gaza, which would rather be helpful here, to sort out these issues, of course, nobody wants to know about it. They want to attack the BBC. And when you look at those people who are opposed to the BBC, I mean, you would expect the Daily Telegraph, you would expect the Daily Mail. You've now got GB News and Talk and others. Do you think it's a more hostile environment than it was when you were doing the last charter renewal?
When I was doing the last charter review, and when I came back from running the Royal Opera House into the BBC, we had hardly any friends, is the truth. And one of the jobs then was to win people to the cause of the BBC and what the BBC could do and the big things the BBC can do for the country, for the world. And I think it's probably more hostile now even than it was then, because when you look at the papers every morning, and I used to when I was running the BBC, you have the cuttings coming at you. You wonder where your friends are. But I think with Samir and with Tim, the case for the BBC is stronger now than a decade ago. And I think that case has to be heard and has to be argued.
If it can be heard, because the noise is so great. I mean, for example, you've also got the difficulty, well, not the difficulty, in some ways it's enriched our lives, but streamers like Netflix and others, so people say, well, look, we don't need the BBC, you got Netflix. There's criticism of the license fee, and a significant number of people are withdrawing their support for that. So, and then you add people, the old commercial rivals, if you like, the BBC, or not so much commercial rivals as those who wish to see the BBC's out of the way so they can prosper more effectively. It is a very tough environment, but you've made the case, I think, in your recent lectures and so on, that it's not. We shouldn't start with the licensee. We shouldn't start even with the BBC. What we should start with is asking the fundamental question of, do we need public service media? What should it be doing? And then what's the best way of delivering it, which I know you would feel would be, certainly the BBC would be one of the leading elements there. But what you're calling for is essentially the BBC not to, I understand, not to first of all say this is about the business. The BBC is a business. This is about the BBC as an idea and a public good, and that they have to make that case. In a way, the BBC now has to go back to first principles and say why a public intervention in broadcasting, or in media, as we should probably say it, is an important thing. Do you think it's as basic as that? They have to put forward that vision almost before they start and do anything else?
I completely agree with you. And I think if you look back at the various charter review processes that there's been in the past, then certainly the one I was involved in 2013 was one where we had to cope with a licence fee over 75s being imposed on us, and then work out what on earth we were going to do with the BBC that had determined. That's totally the wrong way around. And I think it needs a change of perception too, because the BBC is a media company. It's obviously a media company. It's obviously a business in that sense. But the thing which gets overlooked is the fact that it's also a great cultural, creative organisation. It's part of our, as Andy Haldane, the CEO of the RSA would say, part of our social infrastructure. It does so much more for us. And if you go right the way back to regulation in this country is accepted throughout that broadcasting is more than just a business. It's there to have social impact. And I think that's part of the debate which needs to be brought out and argued by the BBC, and start with that and then work through, therefore, this is what we want the BBC to do, and then how do we fund that?
I mean, it's understandable given the pressures that Tim Davie has been under. The BBC licence fee has gone down dramatically in real value, maybe 30 to 40%. And Tim Davie, inevitably, as Director General, has to concentrate on the business, had to look for other forms of where he can get money in the States and everything else. And so perhaps it's understandable that he's focused on the business side, if you like. But what I get from you is the clear message from now is, fine, you had to do that, but now you have to make the case for the very existence. And how long have they got? Can you take us through the process here? Because how long have they got to do this?
Not long. I mean, the process is that the new charter must be in place by the end of, or by 2027. So if you say that means probably sorting out what you're going to do by maybe the middle of next year, then the time for the debate is now. But I think you've also drawn, Roger, attention to a really important point. I mean, somewhere between 30 and 40% has been taken out of the BBC's budget. The VLV say it's 38%, I would go along with that, which has meant that the BBC has basically been in retreat. Now, for part of the decade from 2010 to 2020, you could be more efficient. And what was interesting about the NEO, and I've had this informally as well as formally from them, they felt the BBC was making great strides in efficiency and was basically an efficient organisation. But roughly from about 2018 onwards, and I'm being kind of vague, but roughly that patch onwards, you've been driving efficiency, because of course you all the time want to have an efficient organisation, but basically you're talking about cutting back on the work that the BBC does and the ambition for the BBC. The BBC since then, I think, has been in retreat. And Tim has done a masterful job of directing money to where you can get most and good impact from the BBC. But basically the organisation has been coping with, 2 years of an absolutely flat licence fee when inflation was 8-10% a year, and coping with an organisation in that, I think, has been really difficult for him. So that's why I think you've got to have a debate about what the BBC is there to do, because that flushes out all sorts of arguments about, well, actually, we quite like the BBC doing that, or we want the BBC to do that, and then say, how do we fund this and what is the right way of doing it?
But I wonder whether, well, I don't actually, it'd be unfair of me to ask you this question, but I'll just say that I wonder myself whether the BBC needs almost a Deputy Director General now focused solely on public service broadcasting. Because if you were, in your former job, running the Covent Garden, which everybody says you did absolutely brilliantly, wanted to talk to one person in the BBC who was in charge of music strategy and who had power to commission, you wouldn't find that person. You'd find individual commissioners. You wouldn't find someone who could set the overall strategy and make a commission. And I think that applies to science. I think it applies to religion and a number of other areas. That in order to run that, I think, more efficiently, at the top level, somehow there hasn't been created the space for saying, what should our broad strategy be, say, in the coverage of classical music and elsewhere? Not what you should do, but this is the broad thing. This is what we're trying to do now. Let's find the best ideas. There's a sort of hole there. Now, am I wrong?
So I think that's exactly the debate that we should be having before 2027 about the BBC, and I think I would go down to the genre level as you are too. Because one of the arguments that has been around has been the notion that we've got these streamers now, they are doing wonderful things. They are. It's really adding to our enjoyment and entertainment and factual programming too. That's all good. But there are genres that they don't deal with to anything like the way in which I think the British public would want or should be served. And you mentioned science as one. You could look at religion or ethics as another. There are a number of genres like that. I mean, one of my favourite programmes is Alice Roberts's doing the archaeological digs and what they're showing us about history. Now, there's no way a streamer's going to commission that because it's too micro. It's about the UK. It's not globally significant. So I think this argument about the genres and the way in which we produce content, the BBC produces content, as do ITV and Channel 4 too, by the way, because they're also part of that public service ecology, which is really important. That's a really important debate to be having, because that's part of the richness that public service broadcasting brings to us. And I just say one thing. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, to coin a phrase. These things are very easily destroyed, and they are very precious, and they are hugely admired outside this country. I mean, one of the things you notice as Director General, and Tim, I'm sure, knows this as well, is that once you leave this country, people say, we want a BBC, we love what it does, you're the gold standard. And yet, in this country, we don't see it like that, and we need to.
I mean, I know you feel strongly about local journalism as well, but I mean, I think in terms of conversation about children's programming but how do we want to tool up our children to face the challenges they face now in terms of social media and other things? You know, the BBC has a role, or should have a role there, but as you say, there has to be a conversation first. There has to be a space created in which you can talk about these things. And in the end, the BBC is going to have to do it from themselves. I mean, I'm often struck when occasionally I go onto GB News or whatever, try and defend the BBC or explain the issues, but maybe, in my view, a little more complicated. The BBC never responds. And I understand why in the past, just play it cool, the thing will pass. That tactic won't work now, will it, for the future? No, that you've got it on the front foot. Get out there.
I'm with you on that. I think it's funny when you're running the BBC, you keep thinking you made the argument, and you point to things you've done. And the truth is, you or your colleagues have got to be out there all the time making the case. I think the case in terms of misinformation and information you can trust is really powerful. I think the case in terms of children's television and programming, I know when I look at my nearly 2-year-old granddaughter, I want her to have content that I know we can trust, and that somewhere in the mix there's good British content. And I can't tell you when I was Director General how many parents came up to me and said, thank God for CBeebies, because we know we can trust you to do good content. And I think that's an area which the BBC should be thinking radically about. I think, likewise, you have this amazing into teenagers and young people doing exams called Bite Size. That, again, could be built out. And I think some ambitious thinking and discussion around these areas would be really, really important. Because it's interesting, because the BBC is the only UK media brand that makes it into young people's top 5 brands. You don't want to upset that. We want UK content to young people. It's really important for the future.
But dogging all of this is the question of accountability. I mean, one of the difficulties I think Tim has faced in the last few years is that he, having made cuts which I'm sure were difficult but relatively easy in some ways, now he's had to be cutting things where the audience would disagree. I mean, saying, well, hold on a second, you're cutting something I care about, that I really care and want. You're cutting that back without consultation, and you're moving money to areas I don't care about. And it's almost inevitable that will happen. The less resources you have, spread more thinly, people will feel, I want a say on this. And the thing that's always dogged the BBC has this question of accountability. I spent 20 years doing feedback. Not the most satisfying, but I enjoyed it very much. But in many ways, in terms of real accountability, I'm not sure how much there was. Side by side with, and we'll go on to the question of funding, if the BBC Charter is renewed, we need to do something about accountability, don't we?
Well, there's something in the mutual idea which I don't completely understand, but there's something I would be looking at very hard.
This is the Secretary of State. Earlier was very interested in mutual models, rather like building societies and so on. Yeah.
And the thing which I don't quite understand how it would work, but the thing I do take from that, which is a sense of people having a say, and I think one of the important parts of any charter renewal process should be looking at the BBC's accountability and the way in which the people that pay for it, the licence fee payers, can have some sort of say in the way it operated. When I was Director General, we looked at it wasn't the right moment, but we looked at whether people could become members, that they pay the licence fee, therefore they are treated as members, and through tech, through iPlayer, through all the things you can now do, we could judge what they thought about programmes and think about things that we might want to do that they felt would be quite important.
And what about the board itself? Because that's a crucial element of the accountability, including the chairman. And we know that in the past, very relative recent past, chairmen have been appointed or chairs have been appointed because they're friends of the Prime Minister and they may not have very obvious qualifications for the job. What's your view about that, about the next chair and non-executives on the board who really represent the public as opposed to bringing genuine business expertise?
I think the board and the board membership, and by the way, the unitary board, which is a big reform from last time, I think really, really works. I think the board membership should be decided upon by the chair according to what the needs of the corporation are at the time, as opposed to a number of them being political appointments. I don't think you'll ever get away from the chair being appointed effectively by the Prime Minister. Then the question is how you can make sure that process is proper and open and there's proper scrutiny of it in a fair sort of way. But I think the board then has to work out how, and it's difficult, how you get proper accountability into the organisation. And I just think a kind of a digital membership scheme, I mean, there's something around the way we now operate, which I think could take it to a different level.
Do you think the National Trust, for example, I mean, OK, it has its critics, but at least has a general meeting people can go to and they can vote for directors and so on. Is there anything there the BBC could look at, or any body you can see as things to teach the BBC?
I think the National Trust is a really interesting. I mean, I declare an interest. I've been a trustee until recently when I took over as chair of the Woodland Trust. A wonderful organisation, by the way. I think there is something you can learn from the National Trust. I think they are meticulous in terms of ensuring that issues that matter to the membership are discussed at the AGMs. And although there's been some hoo-ha in the past about it, actually the AGMs are really good occasions when people who care about the organisation, because it's so important, can come together and make their views felt to the trustees and to the council. So there's something around that which I think is really interesting and is, I think, a really good model.
Well, let's move then on to, if we decide where we're passionately in support of public service broadcasting, we think the BBC is central to the delivery of that. Let's go on to the question of funding, because you're quite supportive of a new way of funding. What is it and how do you think it could work?
So I was on a committee in the House of Lords, which just over 2 years ago produced what I think is an excellent Bible to funding methods for the BBC. And we did it deliberately to say, what are the funding methods for an organisation that is basically universal? And I think this principle, just to get to principle a second, this principle of universality is really important. It tends to get lost, but it's a very British thing, which is everybody should have access to great things. It's why the British Museum was founded. It's why the National Gallery was founded. Natural History Museum on the same thing, and it's free at the point of delivery. And I think that's an important principle to hang on to. If you hang on to that, then you don't take advertising because the advertising market's not big enough. You don't go down a subscription model because that's pushing you away from this idea of universal access. So you've got to find something around either a household tax or a reform license fee. Myself, I would be looking at ways of reforming the license fee to make it more proportionate to what people can afford to pay, maybe even looking at whether it could be paid by individuals as opposed to households. When you look at it, I mean, and again, this needs shouting out very loudly, it's extraordinarily good value. It really is, compared to what I, for example, pay happily for Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and so on.
But you're also arguing that I think that the decision on the scale of payment, what the payment should be changed. And you talked about, I think, the possibility of a license fee body or a body to determine that. Now, who would set that up? And we could possibly be in a situation where the government says, well, okay, the body might recommend this, but actually we don't think that's sensible, so we won't do it. So what's the advantage of that slight distancing?
The advantage is it's taking some politics out of it. I mean, in terms of what I think for the Charter, it's taking some politics out of this. If you had an independent body set up to look at what the BBC is doing, what money it needs to weigh that against what licence fee payers are thinking about it, they put down a paper, much as an independent body does, and looks at pay in various sectors, a kind of review body, and the government can then take note of that or not take note of it. But the point is, there's been a proper debate about funding and what's necessary, as opposed to just a sort of seemingly arbitrary, you can have inflation, by the way, we'll pick a particular month where it's particularly low or whatever, which has been the way it's played out over the last decade.
I mean, you were I'm tempted to say victim of an extraordinary set of circumstances in 2013, weren't you, where you do lots of preparation and you brought lots of papers and lots of argument about the licence fee, and you expect, well, not to get everything you want, but a sensible discussion. What you got was one phone call, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. When I went back to the BBC in 2013, there was no preparation for a license for license fee or charter review or anything. None of that was, it was post-Savile crisis. There was nothing, so we had to begin again. But it was a phone call one Monday morning from John Whittingdale, who I respect enormously, just to say I've lost this battle. And we then had basically a week of intense discussion with government, George Osborne, about how if you won't retreat on the over 75s, and they weren't prepared to retreat on that, then we had to have some payback. And we want some payback in terms of changes to the base on which the licence fee was paid. Also, we had an inflationary increase to the licence fee. So one would balance out the other. But basically, when you go back to it, the principle that the BBC should be sorting out social policy, i.e. who should have a free licence or not, is wrong. That's what the government should be. So actually, is there a way in this round with the licence fee to say, OK, this is what we, the government, think should be right. This is the quantum you need, and this is how you get to it in a more proportionate and fair way.
And in your view, and I think everybody else's view, there's no time to lose. So the BBC needs to get its trumpet out. Could I ask you a couple of final questions really on this? Just going back to this allegation of anti-Semitism, which is just going on and on. I mean, there are people of a Jewish background working for the BBC. There are people of Palestinian background to the BBC. There are a great deal of emotions involved. The BBC often makes mistakes, but that isn't the charge. The charge is that fundamentally within the BBC, there is, both sides say it, but at the moment now, a fundamental anti-Semitism within that organisation. And that's a case made by people like Danny Cohen, who used to work for you. What do you say to them? How do you convince them that is not the case?
So I have never seen fundamental anti-Semitism in the time I was at the BBC. It's not how people work. Yes, there can be errors. Yes, there can be misjudgments. But fundamental anti-Semitism or any other fundamental take on life that comes out in the BBC's journalism, I've never seen, and I don't believe it's there. Yes, there are errors. I think the one which is extant at the moment, the BBC are looking at rightly, the board's looking at, it's a serious issue. But to say that is a running sore through the BBC, I think is wrong. I do think that it would be helpful, were journalists allowed into into Gaza to report directly. I think there's nothing like having boots on the ground, people on the ground, to say, this is what we've seen, this is what's going on. I think that would be, to my mind, a very good thing if the Israeli government were to allow that. I think that would be helpful to getting the truth out about what's going on. But something which is a kind of a plot or a sinister, whatever, I don't believe.
And finally, Tony Hall, I mean, you are now in your 70s. I mean, you're significantly younger than me, I should say, but you're now in your 70s. Now, I was going through the other day, well, you keep taking on jobs. You keep taking on chairs. Something you're doing for Birkenhead, not surprisingly, I was rather for Merseyside. You mentioned the Woodland Trust. You're on lots of other. Why are you keeping going at this age? Why don't you retire? Nobody would want you to. I'm not asking you to, but I just wonder, you are driving yourself so hard.
I find it difficult to stop, Roger, and I'm doing things, with the Woodland Trust or with the Natural History Museum. I'm now chairing that, and it's because I believe the cause of the environment, and particularly biodiversity, is fundamentally important. I think the arguments about climate change, people sort of understand. The arguments about the importance of biodiversity, people don't. And I think to say, whilst I'm still, in I hope, a reasonably compos mentis state, that I've spent some time in my life trying to add what little weight I can to these arguments is important for me. It's a cause I believe in, as I believe in public service broadcasting, as I believe in music for everybody. So I keep at it, and I'm enjoying myself, and I'm working with some really good people on things that, to my mind, matter.
Well, please do keep at it. Tony Hall, Lord Hall of Birkenhead, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thanks, Roger. Always good to talk to you.
Our thanks to Tony Hall, Lord Hall, former Director General of the BBC. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please do support us. It will cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You can do it by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. That's it for this week. And as you probably know by now, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.